on what it was like in terms of adoption side. So
Yeah, I was gonna say, did you get to pick your genders? Like how much of the adoption process? Because I had absolutely no idea.
choices.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like yeah. I didn't know anything about adoption. I don't think I actually really met anybody up until I met you who had gone through the adoption process.
And look, it's incredibly difficult in Australia. It's incredibly difficult in New Zealand. And so, to be fair, I don't think I'd ever met anyone that had gone through the adoption process until I came to Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong process is difficult, but the timeline is far different. So in Australia, you're looking at like 6 years from start to end of when an adoption could happen, and even then, it can be unlikely. Whereas in Hong Kong, we put our paperwork in. We started the process early on, but I started a business and there was a few other things going on, so the paperwork took a lot longer than it should have. But once we had the paperwork in and we were in the panel, it took 10 months to match with our daughter Evie. And then on our second adoption with Huxley, it was 10 days. Like, we put the paperwork in 10 days later. We're like,
You're kidding.
hey, you're going to be, a mother to
Why
another
is it
child.
so different? Is it through the same
It just
adoption
depends.
agency? Is it like they already sort of knew you and you've already
That
done a
was a
lot of the
huge factor.
process?
Yeah, huge factor. Also different ages. So Evie was a baby. So she was 9 months old. Huxley was 18 months old. So that factor is a big part of it. It all just depends on, it depends on quite a lot of things. I think our adoption agency really liked us. They fawned all over Connor. They just thought he was the best thing since sliced bread because he was so present. And so, like, a really good dad and things like that. Whereas I think there's possibly a little bit of even a gender problem here too. Whereas I was expected to be, I wasn't allowed, like, they said they preferred people that didn't work. As in mothers. I say mothers, sorry, not people, mothers. That didn't work. They didn't have any expectation of him, Connor. They had all the expectation of me. So that was a really stark difference. And I think what they saw when they came and visited us all the time with Evie was that Connor was super present, and I think they kind of liked that. And they didn't have that expectation of him. To be fair, whether they liked me, I have no idea. But they fawned all over him, so that was great. That was good for the confidence right there.
Yeah, nice.
But yeah, so I mean, what you have to do is when you're making, when you first go into the process, there's a 15-page document, and it's an incredibly eye-opening, self-realization sheet, because what it does is it says, what are your preferences? So you don't necessarily get to choose all this stuff, but there's definitely a preference sheet for everything. But what this is it's a document that kind of says, okay, this is what I'll accept, this is what I might accept, and this is what I won't accept. Basically, what it is you sit down with your partner, and basically Connor and I said to each other, okay, what we need to do is we make sure, A, we have no judgment of each other if we say no to something. So that was really, really important. You could veto something and you didn't have to explain yourself. If it was a no for one of us, it was a no for both of us. That had to be really, really, we had to make sure that was a strong point that we made. We weren't going to shame somebody into saying, for example, there was like a child with disabilities and things like that. We weren't going to shame the other person if they had said no or yes, depending on what the situation was. What we did get told was ours was very broad, and they wanted us to tighten it up a bit, because they were like, you're saying yes to a lot of things, and you've got to realize that, you might get a child with all these things. It's not a matter of one of these things. You could get a child with all of these things. So you need to make sure that you're very clear as to what you will say yay and nay to. So we actually went back and made a slight amendment on some of those things. So the first one you asked is age. So what age would you accept? So originally we went in there with 0 to 5 years old. Then we had a discussion with them, and they said, look, you are Western. These children, if they go up to the ages of 5, they're going to be speaking purely Cantonese, and that is going to be a really hard road for both of you. So they actually made us drop it down to 2.
Mm.
Um, and that made a lot of sense, I guess. And now having Huxley at 18 months, now I can completely understand why that that would have been a difficult road anyway, especially at 5 when it's so ingrained in them and we wouldn't be able to communicate with them at all. And then you get asked sex. So you've got boy, girl, and then no preference. So in my heart of hearts, I wanted to go no preference. In my head, I was already making choices or selections that felt very um, I didn't like how narrow we were getting. It felt like we were choosing a child from like a array of candy store, going, I want this one and not this one and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't like that. That was a really big thing for me. But in saying that, Connor had a real picture in his mind about him as a dad. I'm just not sure he knew how he wanted to be a boy dad, if that makes sense. He
Mm-hmm.
really struggled with the idea of having a little boy, and from a comforting perspective, he wasn't sure how all that would go. He knew with a little girl, he was going to be more cuddly. He's a very cuddly guy, and he was able to be more affectionate. And he wasn't just sure how that was going to go with a boy. And so in the end, we ticked girl. Now, in Hong Kong specifically, more, and which we didn't know, we actually thought we were choosing a girl thinking that we'd have more choice rather than less choice.
Really?
Turns out, no, everyone chooses girls. So here specifically, so we've later asked them, we're like, oh, does everyone choose boy, blah, blah. And they're like, nope. Out of all the people in Hong Kong, they all choose girls, which
That's
I thought was a little bit
interesting.
wild. Yeah, it didn't
That's
quite.
interesting.
I thought like culturally it would be
Yeah, yeah. Well,
boys.
Hong Kong's so different from China, so I guess
Yeah.
that would make sense to me.
Then what we were told. Now I will point out the agency again because of a bit of the communication barrier. A lot of the things we got told were really direct, and it's very surprising. But one of the things was they basically said girls are smarter, and so people choose girls. Um, and I was just like, okay. Like that's essentially what they said to us, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh, okay. And I guess makes total sense. um, but that was one of the things they mentioned to us, and I said, okay. And so I think that also played a card in 10 months versus 10 days also.
Mm,
um,
yeah.
and so that was we picked girl up to 2 years, and then they asked race. So what race would you like? And again, feels very dicey in that area.
Mm,
But in my opinion, no race was ever going to be. I was never picking a race. It was always going to be open. So we did open. I will admit there was some conversation with them that was super uncomfortable in terms of, are you sure you want any race? And we're like, yeah, no, we're adopting from a different country. I mean,
what do you think
race
they
is
were
clearly not
meaning?
an issue. Well, they then came out and said it. Because again, I think language barrier. They came out and said the things that kind of just what they were saying. So at one point they go even black, and we're both like, yeah, yeah, that's why it's a bit dicey. And I was like, of course, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And they're like, okay, we need to check. And I was like, did you need to check anyway? That
Oh my
again, this country sometimes can be a bit dicey when it comes to the race stuff.
Just
So
for privacy reason, we're not going to name who this adoption
no,
agency was.
no, 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 no. And look, that would be a very normal question here,
Yeah.
honestly. And it sounds awful, but that would be. I think in their minds, they're like, "Are you sure you meant all races?" Because when they do that, they don't say all the different types of races. They just say all, and the other choices are like full Chinese, mixed Chinese, Caucasian, mixed Chinese with other Asian races. Like it's very specific in terms of the choices. So I think in their mind, they want to double check. I don't think it's coming from a bad place. I think it's coming from a, we just want to make very certain you understand what you're getting into. Because one of the things they mentioned to us on a regular basis was the a lot of the Chinese couples that were going into adoption were very specific, like
Mm-hmm.
full Chinese, had to be no, no movement or anything like that. So I guess that's where they're coming from. It's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from a, we just need a double check.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know what
yeah.
you're getting something to, which I mean is kind of crazy, but, and it's something that we kind of were kind of taken aback by, but I I understand what they're trying to do,
Yeah.
because they don't want someone to get on have a child. And I do know a story about a child that was matched with a family, and they had opened the race, and they sent him essentially back, for various
No.
reasons. But one of them we thought would be race.
You're
So
joking.
I
Poor thing.
understand on their side, yeah.
Mm.
So anyway, that's the first three questions. That's what you got asked, and then it goes into like everything possible you could be asked in terms of, um, you know, for example, the first one I think is child's family background. So unknown paternity, abandonment, born from rape, born from incest, and it goes. That's where it starts. So, do you know what? One day we'll do a video about the whole sheet,
Yeah.
but I
Oh,
won't go into all of it. But that's where it starts. So
yeah.
you are
You
sitting
got to be
there.
really comfortable with your partner. You got to be really damn
Oh yeah,
sure that you want to adopt because this is really humbling questions. Like,
and one of the things is, um, when you sit there and you think about that, what is it that you're looking at in terms of? I had to start like googling like, what happens if the parent has this disease and the other parent has this disease, but then, what is all this culminate into? What's hereditary, what's not hereditary? So many, and weirdly enough, so many of the questions were not hereditary. So I was like, why are they even asking it? But then I guess I kind of get it, because a few of the other things that they talk about is like, for example, which one of the questions, not that I found it funny, but I was like, oh, why are they even asking this? Was like mother smoking, yay or nay? That's fair. But then they were like father smoking. You're like,
oh, it would be environmental, won't it?
well, no, because they were never being with them, because they
Yeah,
give them
but
up
when
for
the
adoption.
mother was
Like,
carrying the child, being around smokes
oh yeah, I guess
environmental,
so. Yeah,
and now they're coming out with all these studies
yeah, I should know
showing
that.
that there's so many factors that are actually influenced by the sperm quality of the dad. That you're not just
And I guess,
given like like the DNA. It's so much
yeah,
more
yeah,
than that. Like if the dad is like exercising or not exercising, that'll affect the sperm
mm,
quality, which will affect the DNA, which
the
will affect
child
the
at the other
child,
end.
which is insane because you're just a sperm donor. You hardly do
Yeah,
anything. We
mate.
do all the work. But actually, the reality is that no, it really
Mm.
is. Like in terms of effort, I
Yeah,
agree. It's not
yeah, it's
50-50.
definitely a lot less effort. Yeah, but this is the
But
other thing is,
the lead up to the actual insemination, I would say, is
yeah,
really important.
it's
Like
equally
they
as
say, no,
well.
like
Maybe
my
not
mom
equally
was,
as one.
well, no, for both
Oh,
parents, I would say
lead up. Sorry,
the
yeah,
lead
yeah.
up to it because
One of the best pieces of advice they gave at the very first session was that very rarely are you looking at children in the adoption process. Do they have perfect parents,
hmm,
perfect children, completely healthy, completely this, completely that? This is not what this process is about. So when they say things like one of the questions is about just family history, like in terms of socioeconomic groups and things like that. And I'm sitting there going, how is this relevant? But I know it's relevant for other people. So I
hmm,
guess there's a part of me that looks at that. I still remember the first time we went into the panel. I got a phone call about 2 months after we went into the panel. And I got a call from the agency and they said, okay, how do you feel about the mother drinking? And I said, why? I'm going to need a bit more information, because sometimes they would call us and just say, we're just testing the waters as to what you are accepting or not accepting. Because we may have said maybe in terms of the mother drinking, because
hmm.
the mother had like, 3 glasses of champagne over the course of the pregnancy. Cool. They call me and they're like, the Can you hear my dog? They go, she drinks 12 beers a day. I was like, what? 12 beers a day? I was
Like
like,
consistently?
holy. Well, I don't know, but like, I think it felt like pretty regularly.
Well,
And
wouldn't
then
they at
me and
that
Connor
point?
are like,
Because the risk isn't it just fetal alcohol syndrome? Can't they do
yeah,
an assessment after and be like, yes, this child does have fetal alcohol? Like, isn't that more
well,
relevant to you than the amount
it's,
of beers that
I
she had
did
in a
think
day?
that, right? But what I was told later on is fetal alcohol syndrome can manifest itself a little bit later than birth. So
Mm.
that's why that was a big question, which I didn't know either. Because then I'm furiously texting my sister, because she knows a bit, like not her, but like someone she knows. Um, and then I'm like going on Google, and I'm like, oh my god, what are the challenges we would face with a child with fetal alcohol syndrome? And so I'm calling Connor. I'm like, 12 beers, like that just seems like so much. I just feel like this child's gonna come out drunk. I don't know. And it's so confronting. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, it's crazy, but I'll one day we'll go through the whole list,
yeah,
and
yeah.
you can tell me which ones you'll accept. No, you don't have to. But you can at least I'll give people the eye opening of what questions you get asked, and you
Yeah,
kind of like. So when we went for the second adoption, I felt really a bit funny about choosing a gender in the
yeah.
first adoption. And basically, Connor and I sat down and had a really long conversation about. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't like. I like fate a little bit deciding this rather than us choosing.
Mm,
I think that plays too much with, I guess, God in that sense. I'm not that I believe in that, but like it's too playing God, and I don't like that. And I really struggled with it. And I said, look, it's really important to me that we open it up. I don't mind either gender. We had a gorgeous little girl. She was, smart as a whip, beautiful, the whole 9 yards. And we're just like, oh, we'd love a little girl again because she is just, 110%. And we got Huxley, and he is the most beautiful boy. He's so smart, so funny, giggles all the time. And the minute kind of that situation transpired with us, and don't get me wrong, it was tough at the beginning, but oh my God, so glad I opened it up and just
yeah, yeah.
let the
In
wills
fairness, I will
be
say that
made.
you got two gorgeous kids, and
They
it
are
did
very good
knock
looking
the
kids.
myth of like you just go in and they all line up and go like I'll have that one and I'll have that.
Which
That's
people
not how
did.
it goes.
People did think that actually. They're like, "Did you go in and then choose?" And I was like, "No, that's not how it works. You get matched with the child. You don't actually get a picture or anything of them until you meet them, and that's it."
Yeah, yeah.
So
That is
yeah,
so
you can.
funny.
Don't get me wrong. There was a big part of me the night before meeting both kids, and I was like, "Oh God, what if they're really ugly?" Which is horrendous to think about. But you think about that stuff, like it's gonna happen. So, but no, I got
Yeah.
very lucky. Very good looking.
Well, my question was, and it's not a
Mm,
funny one, but it is
it's a
one
serious
that I
one.
am curious about, which is terrible. But like just listening up to some of the questions and things that you'll accept and not accept, like obviously it has to come from somewhere. They don't just like pull these criterias out of nowhere, which
Yeah.
means that they probably came across, in the whole adoption
Mm,
system, children that had these particular, things.
yeah.
Like did it ever like cross your mind that like if you've said no to them because you guys had such a broad thing,
Mm.
more than likely everybody else said no, are these children never going to get adopted?
Yeah, there was a big part of that. What I will tell you though is I was very conscious that this was my dream, I guess. My I really wanted to adopt ever since I was little. And I finally we just so happened to manage to get to a country that gave us this option. And I was so grateful that Connor was on board with
Mm,
this that I allowed ourselves to be a bit selfish with it. And I
yeah.
allowed ourselves to be selfish with it in the fact that we were building a family, we're building a life, we're building a future. We need to be conscious of what we can and can't do. And one of the big things is I love work. I am a worker. Was I built to be a mum? Probably not, in all honesty. I think I'm a good mum, but I am also a worker. And one of the
Mm.
things that you need to deep down think about is how much time and energy can you put to this child. Now, everyone has to have that conversation with themselves, whether they adopt or give birth. What I had the advantage of is having probably think about all the possibilities first before, because I don't think everyone goes through the same idea. Like there's again, this sheet is ginormous about all the things you are scared of, and I didn't, and got the very privileged choice of saying yay or nay to something. I will say that we were very broad in the sense that a lot of it was maybe, because we need to have a phone call about what the situation was before we'd say yes or no to a lot of the questions. I'll just give you an example. Loss of limb. They didn't say what limb. So you're looking at yourself going, is it a finger? If it's a finger, cool. No worries. We can get through that. If it's both arms and both legs, you're like, all
I
right.
shouldn't laugh.
But I mean, look, this is the things that were going through our mind, which was, it just says loss of a limb. And you're like, okay. And I said to Connor, this is where I find it quite difficult because, you know, I don't want to have, a little kid out there who's not getting adopted because loss of limb is a very general term and he's got
Mm.
missing two fingers. Whereas, someone that has needs full-time care, full-time nursing, full-time hospitalization, those things, I mean, it's incredibly different. I did find that a bit frustrating when they would do things like that and they would say, oh, this is what it is. And then they would say, they could have loss of limb, but they could also have mental health issues and they could also do this. So you had to also,
It's a lot.
yeah, bring into mind that all of them could be the same on the one child. So yeah, there was a lot of it was a very long, deep conversations. We did not do this in a day. We did this over
No.
months because
Yeah.
I grew up where disability wasn't like, for example, they say Down syndrome and things like that in terms of the form. And Connor and I had to have a long, long conversation about that because, in my opinion, Down syndrome isn't a disease. Sorry,
Disability.
a disorder that I think limits their life in terms of their enjoyment of life. I dealt with a lot of disabled kids or ones with Down syndrome when I was younger, and as I grew up, he hadn't. So it was again different backgrounds and stuff, and you kind of you talk through everything, and that's kind of a good part of it where you go, well, who would do this and what would we do here, and then all that kind of conversation. So it's a lot, but it's
Yeah. Oh
you
my
do there's
gosh.
so many advantages and there's so many disadvantages,
Yeah.
kind of the whole
I will
whole way of
say now, listening to you and hearing about the process and everything that you have to figure out whether you're okay or not, I much rather just do what we do, which is the baby dance and then hope for the best, and
and then
hopefully they all have 10 fingers and toes. Because damn, that is a process. Like, wow. I mean, you got to be damn sure you want it. You know what I mean? Like, it's really really hard.
yeah, and you know what, I have been so effing lucky. I can't deny that
Mm.
in any sense of the word, and I don't think everyone gets such a smooth. And I look, it wasn't smooth, but it's incredibly smooth for what it could be. But yeah, it's. I won't talk about the kids' biological parents only because I don't plan on talking about it to them until they're much later in age anyway. Um, but yeah, I mean, my kids are fantastic, and
Yeah.
they have no, in my opinion, no real background issues or anything like that I need to worry about. The one thing I will say is that one of the points that I didn't quite realize, and I want people to know, especially in Hong Kong, is my kids were needed to be adopted out. One of the reasons, not all of the reasons, but one of the reasons was socioeconomic problems. So both biological parents had previous children, both that lived with both of them. One of them had three children, the other one had one, and they couldn't afford to have a second or a fourth in one case.
That's crazy,
So
and that's the reality, actually. That freaking hell. I mean, when people pop out 5, 6, 7 kids and live on the benefit, I'm just like, that's That's so unfair because there's plenty of people who would love to have that amount of kids and not be on the benefit, and
Well,
but it costs so freaking much. It's insane.
and even here, the benefits aren't fantastic when it comes down to children and low economic uh, people and things like that. So that was a big one. Like I said to a bunch of people, like in Australia, this just doesn't happen because the socioeconomic groups. Yes, there are obviously people in the lower income and that have more children, but you do get more benefit in Australia than you do here. So you don't have the support here. Their expectations of grandparents and family members to look after children in this country a lot more than say the government. So that was a huge factor. Huge.
Yeah.
So yeah. This is a dicey episode.
I think it was a really good one though, because honestly, I mean, there's got to be so many more people like me, who have absolutely, like you hear the word adoption and then you're just like, yeah, adoption, fair, yeah, and then you don't really dive deeper into but when you do, you're like, holy crap, that's a lot to deal with. A lot of decision making. It's a lot of things to consider.
I think a lot of people. Yeah, and I do think a lot of people think, well, you go into an orphanage like Annie and be like, that one. And you're like, no, it doesn't work that way. But the funny thing is, me talking about it with our friends and stuff in this country has, I think, minimally made one person choose adoption versus surrogacy, which was what their choice was originally. Because also they had met Evie, and I think there's a reality where people are like, if they're in adoption, then there's something wrong with them. I think that's a big factor.
I think it's got more to do with the parents, really,
or that, yeah. Like one of the questions also is like, and this whole back section we can cut out, but one of the questions is, mum or dad, or they kind of do mum and then dad kind of thing, has schizophrenia. And you're like, okay, well, there's like something like a 50-50 chance of the child having it. And you're like sitting there going, what do I make of that particular decision? Like, it's crazy.
Have you ever watched the movie The Orphan?
No, I don't watch scary movies.
You don't like scary movies?
Nope.
Don't watch this one then.
And I said to Connor, we need to get that out of our brains. These are our children, and that's it. That's it.
Absolutely.
This part.
Now, you guys have done fantastic because they seem like such happy kids.
They are very happy kids. Very happy.
Yeah. Welcome to the basement.